Hi everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, AI Rules Are Changing, Key Regulatory Updates for 2025 and 2026. And I'd like to welcome you all today as well to our first webinar of 2026. As always, not much has changed since last year, but I'm just going to give a bit of orientation about the webinar platform before I introduce our speakers for today. The webinar slides are available to the left side of your screen, along with a few helpful links if you would like to explore and learn more about compliance and risks and how we can help simplify and accelerate your compliance processes. We want this webinar to be as engaging as possible, so please do send us any questions you may have and we'll aim to address them during the Q&A session at the end of this webinar. And if you'd like to submit a question for this Q&A session, please use the Ask a Question widget on the left side of your screen. And for any questions that we don't get to during today's live session, we'll make sure to follow up with you directly with an answer from our SMEs. At any time, if you're interested in learning more about our new sustainability product or any of what we offer here at Compliance and Risks, you can click the button Try Sustainability Free at the end of your screen. And last but not least, this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be sent to you within 24 hours. So my name is Orla Morris and I'm the Content Marketing Manager here at Compliance and Risks. And I'm delighted to be joined by Deela Sen and Chelsea Cunningham. Starting with Deela. Deela is a Senior Regulatory Specialist at Compliance and Risks with over 5 years at the company and over 10 years of professional experience. She's a sworn translator and qualified lawyer in Turkey, admitted to the Union of Turkish Bar Association in 2012. Before joining Compliance and Risks, Deela worked in various law firms, industries, and Turkey's largest asset management company. At Compliance and Risks, Deela leads and manages global regulatory projects, supporting clients with AI, battery, and pressure equipment compliance. She specialises in researching and monitoring international legislation, standards, and regulatory developments, and works on consulting and assessment projects covering global requirements. She is deeply engaged in AI policy. After completing the Washington, US-based independent nonprofit research organization Center for AI and Digital Policy's AI Policy Clinic with distinction, she continued as a research team lead, teaching fellow, and currently serves as policy group member. She was also a course facilitator at the Center for AI Safety for the AI Safety, Ethics and Society course. Deela is the Global Ambassador for Turkey at the Global Council for Responsible AI, a charter member of Women in AI Governance, and a member of the Istanbul Bar Association's Artificial Intelligence Working Group. She is a native Turkish speaker and fluent in English. Thank you so much for joining us today, Deela.
Thank you so much also for everybody for joining us today again.
And now moving on to Chelsea Cunningham. Chelsea is a London-based senior regulatory and compliance specialist with Compliance and Risks, specialising in global environmental and product safety regulations for the electronics sector. She also leads the company's knowledge partner network, connecting top law firms, engineering and environmental consultancies, and industry experts to deliver high-value compliance insights. Chelsea holds a BCL and MSc in International Public Policy and Diplomacy from University College Cork, along with an advanced certification in Artificial Intelligence from the Center for AI and Digital Policy in Washington, DC. She is a native Irish and English speaker with ongoing studies in Korean. Thank you for joining us today, Chelsea.
Thanks everyone for joining. Looking forward to digging into the AI requirements.
Amazing. And just before we kick off the webinar and I hand you over to Deela and Chelsea, I just want to provide a quick background about Compliance and Risks for those who are joining us for the first time. So at Compliance and Risks, our mission is to help ensure global companies have the tools and information to build safe, sustainable products in a world full of change. We're the trusted product compliance technology provider for the world's leading brands and have spent over 2 decades honing the digital tools, expertise, and content you need to stay ahead of the dynamic regulatory landscape, proving your product's compliance, protecting your brands, and of course, helping to drive your growth. At Compliance and Risks, we have the world's most comprehensive regulatory database with over 100,000 regulations historically available in C2P. With a global regulatory coverage and expertise across over 10 industries, we understand that regulatory compliance definitely doesn't sleep. And our regulatory expert team is truly global, with 28 languages collectively spoken across our team, all fortified as well by our 30 knowledge partners. And as mentioned, C2P is our enterprise software designed to keep global organizations on top of regulatory changes and their impact worldwide. And this includes early warning alerts, impact probability, productivity workflow tools, and so much more. And with that, I'm delighted to finally hand it over to you, Dila.
Thank you so much, Orla. Hi, and very welcome to everyone. Today I will give you a very broad overview of the EU AI Act and mainly concentrate on the proposed Digital Omnibus on AI. Since this omnibus is a proposal for now, if you are more interested on what is the EU AI Act, please check out the previous webinar called Bird's Eye View on Global AI Regulations. These slides will be shared with you after the webinar, as Orla mentioned, so I put a link in the slide for that webinar for your ease. Well, the EU AI Act lays down harmonized rules on artificial intelligence. It's the first ever comprehensive legal framework on AI worldwide. The aim of the rules is to foster trustworthy AI in Europe. Its main goal is to make sure that AI systems are developed and deployed responsibly within the EU. Depending on the risk level, there are specific rules that providers and deployers must follow. The AI Act became official on August 1st, 2024, and its rules are being introduced gradually over time, as you see here. And the Act applies only to systems that meet the definition of an AI system under Article 3.1, characterized by autonomy and the ability to infer outputs and inputs. The Act adopts a risk-based approach to establish clear safeguards that protect fundamental rights and ensure the ethical development and deployment of AI systems within the EU. The Act categorizes AI systems into 4 tiers, as you see here. These are unacceptable, high risk, transparency requiring, and minimal risk. For the transparency requiring, actually, you may also see in other resources that they are using word limited risk for that tier. So these are the 8 prohibited systems that fall under the unacceptable risk category. Due to the time constraints, I won't go into detail on these points during this webinar, but as I mentioned, you can find detailed information in our previous webinar. Before we dive into the Digital Omnibus on AI, I want to point out another proposal which was published a month ago. It's the first draft code of practice on transparency of AI-generated content. Under the EU AI Act, by the 2nd of August this year, transparency will not be just a best practice. It will be a legal requirement. This includes everything from chatbots to AI-generated images, as well as more sensitive technologies like emotional recognition and biometric categorization. Therefore, until this date, providers and deployers must clearly label AI-generated or manipulated content, like deepfakes, and users must be informed when interacting with an AI system or being exposed to biometric or emotion recognition. As I mentioned, since this is also a draft yet, for the feedback can be provided until the 23rd of this month. The second draft will be drawn up by mid-March, and the code is expected to be finalized by June this year. Now it's time to talk about the Digital Omnibus on AI. Compliance requirements that govern high-risk AI systems are set to apply on the 2nd of August 2027. However, due to stakeholder concerns and implementation delays, the EU Commission has published a proposal for a regulation on the simplification of the implementation of harmonized rules on AI, so-called Digital Omnibus on AI. This proposal is a set of highly targeted amendments aimed at enhancing predictability, consistency, and workability for businesses, public authorities, and national enforcement bodies operating within the EU AI legal framework. Just a note here, on the same date, another digital omnibus was published, which proposes amendments to the GDPR, the e-privacy directive, the Data Act, and other digital laws. And it's a separate proposal, and we will not cover that one in this webinar. So here is a comprehensive breakdown of the key proposed changes by Digital Omnibus on AI. First of all, timelines are being proposed to change. This is a major win for the industry. Instead of fixed arbitrary dates, the readiness-based approach ensures that companies aren't penalized for a lack of harmonized standards that haven't been written yet. Essentially, the clock only starts once the tools for compliance are ready. Readiness-based application is the obligations for high-risk AI systems in Chapter 3, which will now apply following a Commission decision that confirms that adequate supporting measures like harmonized standards, common specifications, and guidance are available for compliance. For Annex 3 systems, these are specific use cases. Rules apply 6 months after this decision or by December 2nd, 2027, which is earlier. And for the Annex 1 systems, these are the AI in regulated products. Rules apply 12 months after this decision or by August 2, 2008, again, whichever is earlier. Providers of generative AI systems already on the market before the 2nd of August 2006 are granted a 6-month window until the 2nd of February 2007 to comply with the technical obligations for machine-readable marking and detectability. The rule for high-risk systems placed on the market before the high-risk requirements apply is clarified, confirming that they generally won't require recertification unless a significant change is made to the system's design. The Commission is trying to reduce the administrative burden by expanding definitions, include small mid-caps, so that more growing companies can access simplified compliance paths. Key regulatory privileges previously granted only SMEs, like only the small and medium-sized enterprises, but now are extended to small mid-caps enterprises. Another important proposal is that the mandatory requirement for staff AI literacy has been proposed to be removed and replaced with encouragement by member states. Also, by removing this mandatory AI literacy rule, they have cut a significant horizontal burden for all providers. Reduced registration burden means no need to register Annex 3 systems in the EU database if the provider documents that they are not high risk. Lastly, the Commission will no longer mandate a harmonized template for monitoring plans. This will give greater flexibility for providers to tailor monitoring to their specific organizational needs. If your AI system performs a very narrow task and you have documented why it's not high risk, then you are now exempt from the registration burden. I mean, after this will be enacted. Similarly, the shift from a one-size-fits-all template to guidance for post-market monitoring allows companies to use their existing internal processes. In this slide, we will cover the governance, specifically how centralizing enforcement for general purpose AI and very large online platforms ensures consistency across the EU. Crucially, Article 4A resolves a regulatory deadlock. It provides a legal basis to exceptionally process sensitive personal data, such as race or health, for the specific purpose of detecting and correcting bias. This allows companies to ensure their AI is fair without violating privacy restrictions that would otherwise prevent them from accessing the data needed for such testing. A new exception allows processing special categories of personal data solely to detect and correct bias, provided strict privacy safeguards are met. The process for notified bodies to gain authorization to access high-risk AI systems is simplified and structured. Notifying bodies must provide the option for a single application and single assessment procedure for notified bodies seeking designation under both the AI Act and existing union harmonized legislation, such as for medical devices. This is designed to eliminate duplication. One-stop shop approach for notifying authorities is to reduce administrative burdens. If a high-risk AI system is covered by both Annex 1, Section A, which is product law, and Annex 3 category, like the use case, the provider must follow the conformity assessment procedure required under the Annex 1 sectoral law base. And new Annex 14 will be added, establishing a multi-dimensional list of codes, categories, and corresponding types of AI systems. This list formally defines the scope of competence for each designated notified body. And as you see here, the three AI product codes are codes linked to Annex 1 product safety legislation. AI biometric codes are codes specific to Annex 3 biometric systems, and AI horizontal codes are codes covering the underlying AI technologies, such as machine learning that processes structured data, single modality generative AI, and agentic AI. AI means innovation, and compliance shouldn't prevent innovation, right? So therefore, the AI Act provides safe spaces for development. Article 57 empowers the AI Office to run EU-level sandboxes, specifically prioritizing SMEs who might lack the resources of big tech. We are seeing a major expansion in real-world testing. Article 60 will allow systems like medical devices or machinery to be tested in actual environments before full market placement. Finally, Article 60.A introduces a flexible voluntary agreement framework. This allows member states to partner with the Commission to test high-risk systems in specialized fields like civil aviation, ensuring that safety regulations are informed by actual performance data before they are set in stone. So thank you. It's all from me for today, and over to you, Chelsea.
Awesome. Thanks, Yula, so much. So I suppose we're going to kind of do a whistle-stop tour today, going through AI regulation and what it looks like in 2026. But I suppose one thing that's really clear, especially over the last year, is that wait-and-see period is over now. So governments are tending to move from voluntary principles to more enforceable rules, just like what Gila's talked about. Predominantly, they're driven by concerns like safety, human rights, national security, social stability, and the likes. So in South Korea and Vietnam, we saw a very risk-based prescriptive framework designed to protect users, maintaining competitiveness. If you look at Japan, by contrast, there's a real favorable, flexible guidance. So there's a promotion of innovation while encouraging social and ethical practices. China maintains kind of the same centralized oversight with targeted regulations, that idea of balancing domestic AI dominance with social control. And then we have the US on top of all of that, which is navigating a very complex federal state landscape at the moment, where the kind of overall goal is to eliminate regulatory friction while safeguarding rights in the Constitution. So we'll delve into that a little bit more at the end, but it's a very confusing space for businesses at the moment. So what this means really for industry is that market access pressure is higher than ever. Companies have to adapt quickly to divergent standards, and compliance is becoming an increasive competitive advantage. So early adopters of mandatory and recommended practices tend to gain credibility and smoother access to things like public procurement, government partnerships, and strategic positioning in marketing, while conversely then startups and foreign entrants to markets seem to face more hurdles in markets where we have things like local representation and reporting and conformity assessments becoming more prominent. So I suppose the strategic takeaway from all of that is regulation isn't about avoiding penalties anymore. It's about aligning your products with technical standards and societal expectations and political priorities, given the geopolitical sphere that we're operating in at the moment. Organizations that anticipate these trends and incorporate compliance into their strategy will be better positioned in that instance to manage market leadership and market access. And so with that in mind, I'm kind of going to take you on a whistle-stop tour, country by country breakdown, starting with South Korea. It's by no means fully comprehensive, but I would love to draw your attention to our colleagues, Giselle and Lynn, did a fantastic AI and cybersecurity white paper that you can access in the resources section of our website to download. And like Dila has alluded to, we also did a webinar on the more in-depth requirements of the EU Requirement Act and looking at more of the algorithmic recommendations in China. So that's there if you want to jump into that in more of a deep dive. But with that, we'll begin with South Korea. So on the 26th of this month, which is I think next week, the Framework Act on Advancement of AI and the Establishment of Trust-Based Systems, more commonly known as the Basic AI Act, will take effect. So this is a landmark piece of legislation. It consolidates 19 separate bills into one single comprehensive framework, which I think is something everybody will welcome. And it covers everything from your research funding to your strict and safe trust requirements for high-impact AI specifically. Although it's a piece of new legislation, it's widely regarded as one of the most complete and prescriptive AI regulatory regimes, as it sets the standard for domestic and international AI operators. So if you're operating AI in South Korea, I've chosen these two particularly. Articles 31 through 34 are kind of the key obligations that you might want to get your teeth into at the beginning. So these focus around things like disclosure and labeling. So you're now legally required to inform users when high impact or generative AI is in use, and you have to clearly label any AI generated media, so like deepfakes and the like. There's a lot of discussion around the watermark and what that actually looks like in practice. So if you're confused in that sphere, don't worry, a lot of businesses are. So we're hoping to see some more guidance from the regulators in South Korea, but it's one to watch. High impact AI systems are a main focus. Operators are now forced to implement risk management systems that ensure human oversight and report safety measures directly to the government. Human rights impact assessments are a huge one. So Article 35 of the regulation has a strong push to evaluate and report potential human rights impacts for high impact AI. So like we've seen over the last year or two, that kind of ESG and sustainability is kind of trickling now down into our product legislation. So it's good to see kind of some sense of harmonization there. And then obviously your life cycle, safety and risk management, documentation is one thing I have to push when it comes to South Korea. So maintain all your documentation of all your risk mitigation and your safety procedures that you're undertaking, as they have to be made available at any time should the MSIT, which is the Ministry of Science and ICT, should they choose to inspect them. So essentially these articles are kind of the legal foundation for where to start with safe and trustworthy AI under this legislation. So kind of if you want to make compliance your top priority, if you're a domestic or a foreign operator, this is a good place to start. Moving on then, so Articles 32, 33, 34 onwards, high capacity AI operators have enhanced responsibilities, as you can see there under this legislation. So like we talked about, the maintaining the documentation and the risk management systems, they're obligated to report safety measures directly to the government, and also they have to comply with publicly announced guidelines on AI safety and reliability. So essentially the safety and accountability element is now very much legally mandated. It's not optional. So if you're in the sphere of high impact AI, you need proactive governance and you need robust operational compliance. It's not included in the slides here. As I was preparing this before we broke for Christmas, and in typical December fashion, we saw a lot of legislation come out. But there's 2 proposed amendments to this. The commentary period ended on the 28th of December. So given that the entry into force is next week, I presume we're going to see some movement. The first one is around user rights. So any high impact AI users are proposed to gain what's called a right of explanation. So that would require operators to disclose decisions around their criteria and their data. In terms of complaints, they have to be handled promptly. But there's a really welcomed AI dispute mediation committee, which proposes a fast track resolution with a court-like authority, so kind of reducing that sphere of getting caught up in litigation and grey zones in compliance. And then the second proposed amendment is around prohibited AI, which are your systems that threaten human dignity or fundamental rights. So the likes of subliminal manipulation, sensitive emotional recognition, stuff that we kind of see mirrored in the AI Act in the EU. So these will face stricter penalties. So there's a proposal of 7 years in prison or 100 million won, so kind of extended corporate liability when it comes to these. We're monitoring these and they're available in C2P, but hopefully we'll see some movement. But if there is any changes or a proposed revision, you can track that in our system. But the takeaway from this is kind of the amendments are signaling that South Korea is following that narrative of ethical AI and user protection becoming real enforceable legislation. So if you're a company operating in the sphere, it's really important that you review your high impact systems and ensure that your compliance with the operational and reporting requirements that we have seen already laid out are top tier and kind of on the mark in that instance. So a key consideration, I suppose, for international AI companies is the designation of the domestic representation. So if your business is foreign and doesn't maintain a local office in South Korea, but you meet certain user or revenue thresholds, you're legally required to appoint a domestic representative with a Korean address. So they'll serve essentially as your official company liaison with the regulators. And there's a few critical responsibilities that they'll take on your behalf. So that's your reporting compliance with your mandated risk management, requesting confirmation on whether you're qualifying as a high risk impact or what your obligations are in clear definition. And then I suppose facilitating communications with the MSIT on things like audits, inspections and inquiries. So that's kind of the main one. And I suppose importantly, while a representative acts as a point of contact, the foreign operator still retains full legal responsibility for any non-compliance or violations, which will include fines, your usual corrective orders or enforcement actions. So from a business perspective, this means that the requirement is not merely administrative for you. It will really affect your operational readiness, your risk management processes, and your market access. So you need to carefully select and empower a qualified representative under this legislation to establish clear internal compliance oversight and maintain your thorough documentation that we talked about earlier, ensuring that your obligations are consistently met, as failure to comply will result in penalties and reputational impact. And particularly given it's a new piece of legislation and a pioneering landmark piece of legislation, it's likely we'll see a ramp up in enforcement over the next year or two in this. Then I suppose with all of that, you kind of ask yourself, what is at stake? So fines, interestingly enough, actually are capped under 30 million won, which is about $22,000 US, but the impact is actually quite significant. So your violations, i.e. your failure to disclose or you're not appointing the correct directive or domestic representative, authorities still have the power to issue corrective orders or request cessation of your AI operations entirely if they feel your safety standards and obligations aren't met. So from an industry perspective, regulators thankfully have responded to feedback and they've signaled a 1-year grace period, which will essentially allow companies to transition into full compliance, hopefully. So that gives you some breathing room. However, a lot of businesses, particularly startups or foreign entrants to the market, remain quite uncertain about what this actually looks like in terms of real life operational requirements. So if you are navigating that market, don't worry, everyone is kind of in the same instance there. So we're hoping that we'll get some guidelines from the ministry on, what that looks like. And thankfully, the Korean ministries are actually quite good with communication and guidelines. So the recommended advice at the moment is that you proactively prepare your risk management systems, documentation and reporting procedures. I think 3 things you're probably sick of hearing at this point, but very much relevant across the whole sphere, to avoid these penalties and hopefully gain a strategic advantage in this market as we begin the ramp up of this AI Act. So moving swiftly on to Japan, which is vastly different. So we had the AI Promotion Act, which which entered into force last June. And it takes a deliberate, flexible approach to governance, which is very unlike South Korea's prescriptive mandates or the EU or Vietnam, for example. So Japan favors voluntary best practice. So the government is really about promoting innovation and promoting ethical AI development and not penalizing missteps, which I think businesses will welcome. Key areas over this, obviously, are your transparency, your explainability, your privacy, and your human oversight really need to be at the core of your tenements of what you're looking at. So Japan encourages companies to implement self-regulatory frameworks and align with sector-specific laws if they are relevant. So essentially, this means that early alignment will open doors to things like public-private AI collaborations, public procurement options. And so the practical kind of takeaway for businesses for this is that Japan essentially operates as a sandbox right now. So your rules aren't enforced with signs, or with fines rather, but your reputation and your ability to access procurement and government projects really depends on how well you follow this framework and the self-implemented regulatory frameworks. However, while AI-specific regulations in Japan are guidelines, do not make the mistake of mistaking soft law for no law. You still have to comply with mandatory safety standards. Example, for hardware, if you have the PSE mark, or any other electrical appliance regulations, if you're in that market, that may apply to you. Similarly, medical devices are one that's quite stringently regulated. Product safety obligations still remain enforceable. Defects, hazards can still trigger fines, recalls, or civil liability. But regarding the AI in the product itself, the recommended practices we talked about, that explainability, transparency, and human oversight, they're not legally enforced, but ignoring them can jeopardize partnerships, access to things like smart city programs, which Japan is noted for, and also your company reputation, which I cannot stress is something that you really need to be careful of. In terms of consumer protection then, AI products must clearly disclose limitations and potential errors, and personal data has to be handled in line with the Personal Data Protection Act. So that's APPI in Japan. So if you fail to meet these standards, you can still result in litigation, regulatory investigation, or even market exclusion. So I suppose as those of you who deal with Japan and the Japanese market, commercial trust is a serious consideration. So even without the hard penalties for the soft law approach, you need to demonstrate diligence in your practices, be they mandatory or recommended, to maintain credibility and operational market access. Then you can see there's some recommended practices in terms of soft law. So they're the ones that we kind of talked about. I won't stay too long on them. And then similarly, you know, if you're facing your soft law, your reputational risks that we talked about, you're likely to be scrutinized by consumer advocacy groups if you're not really implementing, you know, the voluntary frameworks that they talk about. So in practice, essentially, when most companies who will sell AI-enabled products in Japan will often voluntarily adopt the guidelines to gain the trust and reduce their litigation or liability risk. So again, the most important thing that you need to focus on there is consumer trust and business opportunity, which again, I stress is a serious commercial consideration in Japan. Then we've got Vietnam, which was monumental, I think, with the first standalone AI law in Vietnam, which was passed in December, which was an incredibly busy month globally for all of the AI legislation. That comes into effect on the 1st of March this year, and it establishes a risk-based AI framework, so similar to the EU. So you've got your human oversight principles with that still aim of balancing innovation while protecting the users at the core of the legislation. AI systems are classified as high, medium, low, or unacceptable, and obligations for businesses will depend and scale by risk. This legislation applies to both domestic and foreign entities whose AI systems affect users or markets in Vietnam. And foreign operators, similar to South Korea, have to appoint a domestic representative to liaise with these regulators. So again, a common theme is that the authorized representative is becoming a common theme across compliance. I've just chosen to focus in on this particular requirement in terms of high-risk AI requirements for high-risk AI systems as they face stricter operational requirements. So conformity assessment and safety checks in Vietnam have to be completed before operation under Articles 13 and 14 of this legislation. Incident reporting is a huge thing. So mandatory reporting for serious incidents can be done via a single window portal on the government website, and then an inclusion in the National AI System database. The information around that is covered in Articles 8 and 12 of the legislation. Transparency, a big one. So Article 11 outlines specific labeling obligations. So users essentially have to be able to understand how their AI system functions and the limitations of said system. There is some talk around national security, so national security protections and accountability, maintaining that throughout your development and operation. That's covered in Articles 12 to 14, but essentially that concept of demonstrating trustworthiness in the Vietnamese governance-conscious AI ecosystem. So this might be worth having a look at if you deal in the realm of dual-use goods or you deal with perhaps in the research sphere. So just drawing your attention that Articles 12 and 14 might be worth having a look for your business in that instance. But just kind of a quick snippet on, I think, one of the core meatiest parts of the legislation there, which is a good place to start. Then in Vietnam, smart products, similar to its Japanese counterpart, still have to comply with national product safety standards. So that's your EEE, your appliances, alongside any of your conformity obligations. So if AI components influence human safety or are able to make operational decisions or interact with personal data, they're more than likely going to be classified as high risk, and therefore your documentary requirements, your conformity and your oversight and your monitoring will work in tandem alongside your traditional product safety requirements. So just one to note there. Moving on then from Vietnam to China. So China is an interesting one where the AI regulatory landscape is always evolving. And it's an interesting one because they balance innovation with social and operational control. So unlike Vietnam with the single legislation, China uses really targeted rules for applications like generative AI, algorithmic recommendations, deepfakes. China requires content labeling and measures to guide measures to prevent misuse. High impact systems, like most of its counterparts globally, face scrutiny in terms of stricter scrutiny, incident reporting, security assessments. Enforcement is rampant in China. There's already been fines and shutdowns in this sphere. Oversight is generally centralized by the CAC, and they pilot new governance approaches in terms of funding domestic and international AI. So if that's a sphere you want to look into, the CAC is your go-to there. But for businesses, what this means is that compliance is operational, not optional, right? So you have to meet content, security, reporting, and all those other requirements to avoid penalties, service suspension, or even blocked market access. Early alignment, again, though, builds the credibility and unlocks participation in China's rapidly growing AI ecosystem, which is always a plus. So in short, China is high opportunity, high regulated market, but success requires careful navigation of both innovation and compliance. So China regulates, like we said, AI systems priority to a multitude of targeted approaches. So you have the AI content labeling measures. You then have sector-specific standards, rather than a singular EU AI product law or something like we see in Vietnam, for example, and in complete contrast then with the laissez-faire approach that Japan takes. So like I said, we did kind of an in-depth dive on the webinar that we did previously in terms of algorithmic recommendations and stuff like that. But key frameworks, I suppose, to draw your attention to at the moment. So last September, I think it was the 1st of September of 2025, the measures for the indication of AI generated and synthetic content were published and they entered into force. And they were accompanied by a very, very useful resource, which is a labeling standard, GB 45438. It's the 2025 edition. So Chinese standards are incredibly thorough, which is very, very helpful when you're looking to gain access to the market. And luckily and interestingly, these measures function quite similarly to the EU conformity regime, which is good if you have products on the market on the EU already, particularly of note of generative AI output. So while sector-specific rules may still impose additional pre-deployment requirements, it's quite easy to navigate through the system in terms of conformity and the regime. Like most places these days, platforms have to label AI-generated content. In China, this is done by embedded machine-readable metadata, and you have to maintain ongoing monitoring records and logs for inspection. So like South Korea with its documentation, China is also very much heavy on the documentation and the ongoing monitoring, so ensuring your record keeping is consistent. So ongoing content monitoring and compliance reporting to authorities are mandatory. So this is to essentially ensure that the AI outputs remain transparent, accountable, and aligned with regulatory expectations in the area. And a really interesting development, I think some of you have probably seen in the news over the last few weeks, and again kind of slipped in there in December, it was a proposal on draft human-like interactive AI. So these are designed to regulate chatbots and AI systems that simulate human behavior, kind of pushing on that narrative of providing balance between user safety, mental health, and social stability. So kind of delving into that, more nuanced version of AI legislation that we're seeing. So under this, it's proposed that clear AI identification and usage alerts have to be provided to users when they're interacting with AI. There's a proposal that monitoring and intervention protocols for psychological and behavior risks will be introduced. Content restrictions looking at preventing harm or illegal activity, and obviously your usual compliance with data privacy and security laws. And obviously, given the sphere and the conversations around generative AI and human-like interaction at the moment, this is quite a prevalent topic, so I've chosen to include it. These proposals are quite ambiguous, and they remain very vague on how potentially we're going to implement them. So there's a lot of concern around surveillance and ethical use, but this is actually open for consultation at the moment. So I've put a link in the slides, which you'll be able to access. So it's closed on the 25th. So you've got about a week or two to go in there, have a look, and submit some commentary. But it's an interesting one because it's the first time China has significantly attempted to govern AI's emotional and societal impact. And you might be wondering, why would I really care about this? And kind of beyond chatbots. But the interesting thing about this is while this draft does specifically and explicitly target chatbots, the language is broad enough to include smart devices that interact with users in a human-like way, which really opens the floodgates. So if you think of a smart fridge that offers a recipe suggestion, for example, or if you have a home assistant that manages your appliances, or even if you have a toy that can respond conversationally, these products could theoretically fall under the same labeling, monitoring, and risk management requirements that are proposed in this. So while these rules are still vague in implementation, it does create a little bit of uncertainty, and I think it's one to watch. Uncertainty and opportunity, I think. So I think if you're a company that proactively integrates the transparency and the monitoring that is provided under these draft proposals, I think you can position yourself in a unique place in the market whereby you're aligning yourself with the thought where Chinese regulators are now thinking about AI in all forms, not just software, right? So any consumer product that has a human-like AI interaction could be subject to compliance obligations. So the early preparation that you take now potentially can save you time and resources and reputational risk later, all three of which we know are extremely costly. And can even provide a competitive advantage, as if China are proposing these standards now, other markets will watch closely, and given the proliferation of this in the news at the moment, it's not unlikely that other markets aren't going to regulate similarly. So I think it's a good step kind of up in sense of getting ahead of the curve in this instance. Then moving on to the US, I've just put some key trends there, which we're probably all familiar with at this stage, you know, innovation, deregulation, ethical AI. There's a lot to look at when we're talking about the US, right? Challenges for businesses, they're the usual, they're the same challenges they've always been, with that fragmented sense of, you know, deregulation and what's actually happening in that patchwork phrase. So the US published a executive order 14365 in December, and essentially this was to establish a federal AI framework designed to reduce the patchwork of state laws. So previously we'd no federal AI legislation, and it was quite confusing, and that patchwork was quite difficult for businesses to navigate, right? So this executive order, essentially, the DOJ have set out an AI litigation task force, which now has the ability to challenge state regulations that will conflict with federal policy. There's a particular focus on ones that restrict AI outputs and those that impose disclosure requirements, which are two very prolific areas for businesses that deal in the AI sphere. So at the same time, these key states have active deadlines while that's happening. So you have the likes of Texas, you have the likes of Colorado, you have the likes of California, who all have impending deadlines. So even just the 1st of January gone, Texas have a Responsible AI Governance Act that took effect. So now companies have to monitor both federal and state requirements, and then have to align with national standards to reduce conflicting obligations. So it's a really confusing sphere to be in. So essentially, proactive compliance that we always talked about isn't really risk management anymore. It's kind of becoming the only way to have a strategic advantage in the US AI market at the moment. And so with this executive order, obviously, you know, we got it in mid-December, but breaking it down, there's a real reality in there that isn't very, you know, obvious to see on the forefront of it, whereby it's kind of described as a federal safe harbor. But in practice, it actually offers no immunity from liability whatsoever. So if you states like Texas, Colorado, and California that already have enforceable legislation, federal preemption rather, then is likely to be litigated for years. And so what that means for companies essentially is there's a potential to be caught in a legal trap. So you're stuck where you have to comply with federal guidance, and then you also have to comply with state mandates, or else you risk civil penalties, regulatory fines, or even possibly injunctions. And so with the ability that we talked about with that DOJ task force being able to challenge those state laws, outcomes are quite uncertain for businesses, right? So you get this potential of being stuck in a gray zone of compliance risk, which, as we all know, whenever there's a gray zone of compliance and we don't really know what happens and we're tied up in litigation, it means two things. It means one, market disruption, and two, it tends to be incredibly costly for business. So from an operational standpoint for your business, multi-state AI operations now face complex reporting, transparency, and governance obligations, while also having increased exposure to audit, subpoenas, and litigation. So you've got a twofold, right? You've got overcompliance, where you take the route of overcompliance, but then that could potentially hinder the innovation in your business, and then you're kind of playing catch up. Or then you've got the sphere where you take undercompliance, but then you risk significant legal and reputational consequences. So there's really a no win-win for businesses here. But I think the most important thing is to watch it, and also make sure that you realize that that executive order 14365, it does not shield your company from liability. So firms still have to operate as if enforcement can come from any level of government at any time. So that's federal or state. So you need to plan accordingly. That's through robust legal compliance and risk management frameworks, which I'd say you're probably blue in the face from hearing me say. Given that particular US landscape now, you have to treat AI compliance as legally binding all over, not optional. So when I sit down and look at this, I think the best way to approach this from a business standpoint is to, one, sit down and map your exposure. So identify the states that your products operate in, identify which of your operations are high impact systems, and set that out. Then you're going to have to look at federal guidance, right? So you're going to have to look at the executive order, which I would treat as your baseline. You centralize your policies in your business around reporting, transparency, and audit readiness, while also simultaneously tracking state-specific obligations. So the likes of Texas, Colorado, California, and New York, who already have deadlines in force. And some of them have, compliance deadlines running up to 2029, if not further. So have a look at that and examine what in that conflicts with federal guidance. And then as a result, internally, strengthen your legal and compliance infrastructure. So have a chat with some of the guys at Compliance and Risks about what C2P can do for your company and how we can help you mitigate that. And also internally, dedicate your teams, engage your counsel. And also, I think there's no harm in creating scenario plans for what happens, when we talked about earlier, the likes of what does happen if there's an enforcement or a litigation gray zone? How does that affect my products? And then on an operational side, I think it's really important to ensure that as a company, any decisions you make in relation to your AI systems have to be explainable. They have to be, if there's any complaints or any issues that you run into, that has to be handled promptly. And you have to mitigate risk on an ongoing manner. So I suppose a lot of information to be thrown there, and I suppose not the greatest picture of, the patchwork issue being solved, but just definitely something to be aware of. You can see there, that's just a quick synopsis of upcoming key state lines and deadlines. That's only a short snippet. That's not even all of them. But you can see there, like 2026, you've got 4 or 5 running into 2027. All of these are available in C2P with a fully summarized summary and then all your compliance deadlines. So if you need to have a look at them, you can search them in the database. But I suppose overall for the presentation, Dila is going to run through just the key takeaways in the EU, but I'll just start with, for the South Korea, essentially the AI Basic Act comes into force next week. So I suppose the main thing I would take from that is, if you're a foreign business, see if the thresholds apply to you and see if you need to appoint a domestic representative. That's a good start. In terms of Vietnam, make sure that you're in line with the mandated conformity assessments and incident reporting for high-risk AI. So if you feel like you're going to drop into that high-risk AI sphere, then you need to be aware of it and you need to start proactively planning. China, the AI labeling came into force in September of last year. Keep an eye on those draft rules. Even if chatbots aren't your realm at the moment, just potentially what they could do for appliances, the ones we talked about, like toys, how that could potentially affect you down the line. And then Japan, the main thing, soft law does not mean no law. So just make sure that you're managing your commercial risk there very, very carefully. And Dila, if you want to just pop on there and just take them through the key takeaways for the EU.
Sure. So I just wanted to add two points. As I mentioned here, the ban on unacceptable risk AI systems, such as social scoring, which I mentioned that there are 8 of them. So they will become legally enforceable on the 2nd of February. Sorry, it already came in last year. And another one is a new Digital Omnibus on AI, as I mentioned and talked about as the main point. This proposal may extend compliance deadlines for high-risk systems to 2027 or 2028. So yeah, these are the main takeaways from me.
Perfect. So thanks so much. I'll hand you back to Orla and she'll open the floor for our Q&A session.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Dita and Chelsea, for that, as you call it, whistle-stop tour through all of the various AI updates around some key regions. And thank you all so much for your attention so far. We have the floor open now for our Q&A session. And as mentioned at the start, if any of you have a question that you would like us to answer, please do let us know using the Ask a Question widget to the left side of your screen. We've had plenty of incoming questions throughout the course of this webinar, so not to delay, we'll answer some of them now. And as mentioned, any we don't get to, we'll reach out to you directly with an answer. So the first question is, what happens if the harmonized standards for high-risk AI systems are not ready by the original August 2026 deadline in the EU AI Act?
Okay, so you will remember that on the slide, under the new readiness-based approach, the compliance clock only starts once the EU Commission confirms that supporting tools like harmonized standards are available. If standards are delayed, the backstop date for Annex 3 systems is December the 2nd, 2027. And for Annex 1 systems, it's August 2, 2008. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you. And the next question is, does Japan categorize AI systems similar to the EU in any way?
So no, and it's really interesting. So unlike the EU AI Act, Japan has that very laissez-faire approach. So they do not explicitly categorize specific AI. Instead, the whole focus in Japan is the core principles that we talked about. So like the transparency, the explainability, mitigating your bias, and I suppose ensuring that you're adherent to data protection. So they're all integral components of the risk-based methodology that we see in other regions, but they don't explicitly categorize it in Japan. But again, I would draw back your notice to ensuring that the voluntary frameworks that you undertake, you know, it's more in your interest to adhere to something like that. So if you have a product and you know that it could potentially impact critical infrastructure, energy markets, or a medical device, for example, you know, taking a voluntary framework or implementing compliance in your organization that you know is going to match that to keep that commercial trust in there.
Great. Thank you, Chelsea. The next question about the EU AI Act. Does the requirement to label AI generated content apply to generative AI systems that are already on the market?
Yeah, yes, but there is a grace period. So providers of generative AI systems available before the 2nd of August 2006 will have time until the 2nd of February 2007 to comply with technical requirements for machine readable marking and detectability. However, the general transparency rule ensuring humans know they are interacting with an AI becomes a legal requirement for everyone on the 2nd of August 2006. Yeah.
Brilliant. And this could be our last question of the Q&A session. Who is a designated entity under Korea's AI Act?
Yeah, so that's twofold. So at the moment, even though the act is coming into force next week, there's actually a draft enforcement decree that was published back in November, where essentially you'll need to appoint a foreign authorized representative if you meet certain criteria. So in the draft at the moment, it's if you have over 1 trillion won or more in annual revenue or 1 million or more domestic daily users, then you need to have a designated domestic agent. I expect we'll see that finalized very soon, if not in the incoming week. But that's what it is at the moment. So we just have to wait and see till we get that finalized version. But that's what it is at the moment.
Perfect. And yeah, we actually have time for one more question. In South Korea, please detail what designated high impact AI systems are or the scope.
Yeah, so the AI Basic Act, under that, high impact AI are artificial intelligence systems that can either significantly affect or pose risk to things like life, physical safety, infringe on basic human rights, critical infrastructure. So you're looking at any legislation or any legislation or products that could potentially affect the energy supply, drinking water production, medical devices, and nuclear materials. You'll see it in financial and employment decisions in terms of social scoring. In the Act, Article 2 and Article 3 set out definitions and purposes and the basic principles. So you can go in there and it'll reference the relevant legislation. So if you, for example, have a drinking water production that you fear might be a high impact AI system, you can then go to the Drinking Water Management Act and that will allow you to see whether you come in under sphere. But generally, if it threatens life, physical safety, or basic human rights, in any of the critical infrastructures, then it's generally going to be high risk. So quite similar to its EU and Chinese counterparts in that instance.
Amazing, great. As mentioned, any questions, keep submitting your questions up until the end of this webinar, because any that we don't get to, we will reach out to you directly with an answer. But I'd like to thank Dila and Chelsea so much for all of that information, that critical information, especially in this ever complex AI regulatory landscape. So really do appreciate your time and expertise.
Thanks so much, Orla.
And
thanks, Orla.
thank you. Thanks. And thank you all for tuning in with us today. We really hope you found today's presentation helpful and seeing you in our upcoming webinars. You can check out our resources section on the Compliance and Risks website to stay updated and to access our latest white papers, blogs, and of course, webinars, both on demand and upcoming. And with that in mind, we do have plenty of upcoming content, so do make sure you keep an eye out. Next Wednesday, January 21st, we have a customer-only webinar coming up, showcasing how we are helping global teams move from manual research to AI-driven sustainability regulatory intelligence. So if you're one of our customers, do make sure you register for that. It'll be super insightful. And our next public webinar for both customers and non-customers is our very popular Chemicals Quarterly Q4 2025 regulatory update, which is scheduled for January 28th, and it's not to be missed. We hope to see you there. So thank you very much for tuning in with us today, and have a great rest of your day.